Welcome to the latest episode of GrowthChat. Today our guest is Raul Sanchez de la Sierra from the Harris School in Chicago University. Welcome, Raul. We're very happy to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
So we will be talking today about Raul's paper that came out last year in the Journal of Political Economy entitled On the Origins of the State, Stationary Bandits and Taxation in Eastern Congo. And to get us going, Raul, maybe you could tell us, why are economists interested in the origins of the state?
Okay, so I think the question for me is in a broader context. I believe that there's a long series of assumptions that economic analysis makes, especially since the 60s, that reflect the specific historical context in which it was being done and that we have inherited. A lot of them were progressively uncovered, whether it's externalities or whether it's the assumption of perfect information and whatnot. But at the time, it was the Cold War, and in economics was being made in probably the strongest state globally in historical perspective. And so a lot of those assumptions that we take as granted in society, like we think of a state as a state of nature almost. I grew up in France, there's always a state. I never thought about the state as like having to form, it just arises with nature. And so as a result, that infuses, I think, economic analysis, like we assume that transactions operate in some sort of vacuum where contracts can be made without transaction cost or where property rights are just enforced. And so typically economic analysis historically boils down to identifying what a social planner would choose, and then just governments just would do it. And that's the problem of human societies, is to tell the government what to do. But unfortunately, this is a very weird assumption in historical perspective. It almost never was the case that there was a central government that could implement things. Most of what we know about human evolution is about states forming, and that process is embedded with coercion and violence, often with slavery, often with tribute. And so, the absence of a state, typically, we don't know what it is, but we tend to imagine as being creating some sort of tragedy of the commons, because there's no one preventing humans' basic instincts of expropriating others. So philosophers have imagined what that may look like. Hobbes, for instance, speaks about this life without the Leviathan, without the state, as being brutish and short and nasty. In general, we tend to think that despite the fact that states arise through violence, they are also associated with being a necessary condition, at least in the West, the way we think, for economic growth, because they protect property rights, because they can tax and allocate resources in a way that solves public goods problem. The problem is we don't know how this thing may be important for economic growth, but we don't know how it forms. Only philosophers told us that maybe it's a social contract. And that's very valid in many contexts, but we have very little evidence to support that. Most historians and anthropologists who study the formation of states typically emphasize the role of violence by an elite having incentives to expropriate others, but little by little they make this expropriation more and more sophisticated in ways that then create some legacy that can be used also for public goods. And so I just want to add a note of nuance, like, we think states could be important for economic growth, but that assumption also that motivated my own research is, I believe, quite Western-centric, in the sense that there's many other forms of governing economic exchange and exercising authority beyond centralized states based on coercion, and that, I think, is an exciting area for future research. So, yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you. But in your research, you don't go back to European countries, hundreds of years of when the states arose, but instead you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo in modern times. And why that choice?
That's an excellent question. So why I ended up going to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the real answer is by mistake. I ended up going there as a research assistant. I didn't know there were two countries with the same name. I found it interesting for my own education to go, but it's only going there that I realized that a lot of the preconceived ideas we have about a state existing didn't work there and had to be relaxed. Initially, I had perhaps this very Western-centric instinct that, oh, the state doesn't exist or the state is broken. Now I think about it differently as being of a different form, perhaps. But over time, I built strong ties with the place. But one thing that emerged is that initially I was research assistant for a development project, impact evaluation. And when I stepped out of that box, I realized that what seemed to really matter to people was these people with guns. They were everywhere. There were hundreds of armed organizations that faced trade-offs that ended up being similar to the trade-offs that the Congolese state faced itself. So you would go to the interior of the country and you would see armed groups who were not the state providing security, collecting taxes, creating markets, providing other forms of public goods, in some cases, enjoying some forms of legitimacy. And the state forces, on the other hand, in many other places would be engaged in pillaging and violently expropriating the population. And so you would, by talking to people, and I ended up basically spending a lot of time talking to these people with weapons and people who lived under them, you realize that all of these things that we tended to associate to state formation in history in Europe, through Charles Tilly, for instance, you would find them there too. And so it was a good context to say, perhaps at the same time, de-exoticize the African continent. It's like there's nothing unusual in that continent necessarily, or at least we don't need to assume. Look, the same processes that we document take place, it's just outside of the state lens. Now, one nuance is I didn't go there, let's say, from the perspective of the study to answer the question, why did state form? Because that's why I spent a lot of time in the title, the origins in plural of the state in singular, because there may be many reasons why state arise. One of them, we see it in the historians in Europe, with Charles Tilly, being perhaps war, perhaps taxation. And so that was one example of that one origin playing some relevance. And so I want to contextualize it by kind of nuancing the claim that we found finally the one origin of the state.
Amazing. So then you realize that minerals play an important role in that part of the country, right?
Yes, it turned out that in this part of the country, there's a very rich economic landscape. And one important dimension of that landscape are minerals because of their economic value. So they could play an important role in changing the economic trade-offs of the armed actors. And often the trade-offs I was interested in is it profitable for them to set up shop, to create some sort of monopoly of violence in a location, to start taxing, to start protecting, versus perhaps being somewhere else or perhaps pillaging arbitrarily, which they also do. And so minerals were interesting in the sense that they are valuable, and at the same time, while talking to people, everyone referred to these shocks. And as economists, we're always looking for shocks. And so I thought, oh, here are armed actors, here are minerals, and there is a shock. So it seems straightforward to connect the two, potentially to answer the question of when do they change the strategies. Then the second step was talking to these armed actors. All of them told me for the months preceding the study, is like, oh, gold, don't worry about gold, because you just can't tax it. People are swallowing, they run away. So we have to do very different things there. We can't settle whether it's gold. We go perhaps to the towns where people become rich because of gold, but certainly not in gold areas themselves. So then there you had kind of the setup that motivated the study and why minerals became important.
Thank you. So what's the relationship between minerals and actors?
So in fact, it's a very complex one, and I'm still struggling to find the answer. The challenge is when I arrived there and in the West, we tend to see that view of conflict minerals, and minerals cause armed actors or cause conflict. And in fact, it's complicated. On the one hand, there is the most valuable minerals of the whole country are copper and cobalt. They are in the southern part of the country in Katanga. There's no armed actors there. Everything is industrialized. So one question that could emerge is why didn't armed groups develop there? There's many reasons. It's more nuanced than armed actors don't emerge when minerals are necessarily. There's a history of Belgium and the Congo leaders wanting to preserve stability in that area. But on the other hand, there are the minerals in the war zone. And so what are the relationships in that particular zone? Well, the origin of armed groups in that area was mostly political. The Congolese state collapsed in the 90s completely, and then neighboring countries came in with weapons. They had political objectives to eradicate their enemies, to take cover. Little by little, they created more and more access to armed actors. And that led to the Second Congo War, 98-2004. That's where the connection with the armed groups and minerals was huge. And I think a lot of our view about minerals is informed in the Second Congo War, where you had military networks going up to the #1 of the defense ministry in Rwanda. And a lot of armed groups from Congo with ties with Burundi, Rwanda, or Uganda, strategically, intentionally playing a role in the extraction of minerals. But after 2004, it became more complex, especially because this exposure of armed groups in the area slowly transformed society into a militarized society. And that's not something that I concluded. This is from the work of a colleague of mine who's a sociologist expert in the Eastern Congo, but it's also something that you see very often. Armed actors are entrenched in absolutely all aspects of life. It includes minerals, but by now it's very often much more about mercenaries operations, having political patrons, providing protection. Every armed actor specializes in many different things, to the point that if you were to remove minerals today, it's quite likely that the system would continue. Perhaps certain dimensions respond to changes in the value of minerals, but I would say that would be on the margin at the macro scale at this point. So if we would look historically, minerals played a big role in leading to that situation in the Second Congo War.
So Congo has a lot of minerals. Can we say that this endowment of minerals impacted a lot the political equilibrium there?
So yes, here is what I know. In the south, where you have the industrial mines, for decades these concessions were a central source of stability for the regime, and the regime is mostly the presidential office, the presidential network, presidential family. The way they managed to retain revenues from those areas is by exercising political power to a large extent. We view the Congolese state as being very weak. At the same time, it's very strong in whatever it wants to achieve. And so from the point of view of the presidential office, the networks of the presidency are the most powerful and scared in the country. The Secret Service goes everywhere and is extremely developed to bring information up to the presidency. So what happened there is you had systems of corruption that involved scandals that recently were in the news with a trader called Dan Gertler and the Panama Papers which was a channel through which bribes were being constantly paid to the presidential office to maintain concessions in the south. So that's one way in which it contributed in creating some stability, because the most powerful network gained access to it. Before that, minerals and political equilibrium was as fascinating as it was complicated, because during the Congo Wars, you had armed groups that had connections with mining corporations outside that were financing the movements directly, not with governments. One of them was documented to be a Canadian mining corporation financing the AFDL movement, giving them a private jet even. The implicit agreement is something that is commonly known as a booty future, where private firms act like a bank and they invest in a rebel movement because they think the rebel movement has more chances to take over, and in exchange they expect the concessions if they take over. So at that time they contributed on the one hand to destabilize the regime, but on the other the regime also knew in the 90s that they could get the same benefits. So what Kabila's father during the war did was to basically sell off the country to obtain support from foreign armies. And there was 12 different African countries fighting in exchange for getting access to minerals. So I guess overall, it may have kept the balance of power similar, but it certainly intensified the conflict by increasing weapons on both sides. And today it's more complicated in this. I don't know exactly how minerals affect the political equilibrium. I know how armed groups have a role. They are a branch often of political patterns, but it's much less connected to Congolese politics today as it was or is connected to Rwandan politics through the military networks that remain in place.
Now, in the area you study in Eastern Congo, the two minerals that play the biggest role are coltan and gold. And you find that in areas where these two minerals are prevalent, that you see different outcomes in terms of the violent actors. Could you describe those results to us? What exactly you find there?
Yes. So one of the things that that was clear from talking to the armed actors is that the coltan boom was a massive motivator for them to develop extraction systems that look like a very basic first step in the process of state formation. So in places that had coltan, in the year 2000, the price of coltan went up from $90 to $600 a kilogram. You see armed actors protecting monopolies of violence in that area, taking control basically, and developing taxation system around taxation of output, customs systems. Qualitative evidence shows that they even have visa systems to enter into their areas. They were also providing protection. And so that very simple first step of state function did not happen when the price of gold went up. There was a different price, it was at a different time. So a lot of the work in the study is to try to see if after that main result, the second result can be compared. But what happened in the gold areas is people mine in rivers, most of the mining, and gold is very difficult to find. Unlike coltan, which you can put a customs taxation for 70 kilo, you pay so much. People may spend 5 days and find nothing, and if they find a very small pit, it could be $2,000. So they typically swallow it and run away, and then they sell it outside of the area. So armed groups struggle to tax output or simply cannot tax output. Now they have a kind of second best way to tax if they really want to settle there. They sometimes tax the entry into the mining pit in expectation of how much you may make, but it's very risky for the miners because they don't know how much they will make. It's very difficult to control kilometers of river. So in the end, what armed groups did is they realized that the rise in the price of gold makes some people richer. And who? Well, the miners and their families. So where they live, which often is like 2 days walking from when gold is being mined. You have to think of mining as like a temporary work where people go 5 days, they come back to the town, or people who come just for half a day. So what happened is in the towns that were connected, where the families lived, there you had more money in circulation. People bought more in the market, maybe they had more cattle. And so you see a response in those locations. They become richer, armed groups tend to settle more. Perhaps the effect is slightly weaker than in gold. But what do? They don't tax output. What they do is they tax households directly. They create capitation tax systems or poll tax systems that mimic or that are similar to the taxation systems Europe had before the income tax about 100 years ago. And then they develop other sophisticated taxation schemes, such as market taxes, for which they sometimes even create the local market so that they can tax, or taxes on the local mill. One very important one is taxes to enter and leave the village. So that's one way to capture economic activity. And so on all the things that are easy to observe. And that's what they do. Now, there was also some evidence that in order to, or together with those taxation systems, they also begin creating fiscal administrations and administrations of justice in those villages, which is consistent with there's more money in circulation, it's difficult to tax, it requires a bit more effort than just someone at the door saying how much you have is a big bag or a small bag. And so especially for poll taxes, or anecdotal evidence suggests, not just for, so for poll taxes, many armed groups have to collect censuses in the village, and they have a system of tokens where they check whether every household has paid. But also in some armed groups have what they call éclaireurs or enlighters, where in the village checking if some people have more money than usual so that it can be taxed. And so these mechanisms are what you see emerging in those places, but not in coltan places in response to the price of coltan. And there was an interesting analogy, which is just an analogy, not interpretation, but the coltan state formation process, or whatever happened there, looked very similar to how the English state is described in fiscal sociology in history as being mainly based on international trade. So it was very easy to tax international trade with customs. It required minimal infrastructure. But the French state economy was based on a large number of small-scale transactions in the interior. So there's this sociologist, Gabriel Ardant, who describes all the sophisticated steps that the French state took in order to gain control over revenues in the interior, including creating markets, including putting walls around the cities to control the entries. Yeah, so that's yeah.
Wow, fascinating. Now then, typically when we think about violent actors today, and we think of, say, the mafia in Italy, we think, oh, this must be bad in welfare terms. But you say in your paper that in terms of welfare, the presence of these violent actors was even beneficial. Could you give us some intuition for that?
Yeah, it turns out so. After having described whether what may explain different choices that they make, a crucial question to ensure that it was a relevant phenomenon to study, at least for economists, is that their presence could potentially be beneficial. It turns out that the results were much more nuanced. And so in order to identify whether their presence is beneficial, I couldn't look at these price changes, because maybe if in response to a price change, the village is better off, it could be because of the bandit or because of the price change. And so using a different strategy, what we find is that these armed actors, when they develop these basic state functions, can increase the level of household welfare compared to when they are absent. But that's not true for a large number of those actors, those who are foreign. And so a very important distinction in the Congolese conflict is there's a lot of factions that come from Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda, whose loyalties are to neighboring countries or to ethnic groups in other countries, such as the FDLR towards the Hutu. These groups have very little interest in the well-being of Congolese populations. They are there to fight proxy wars, or they even have bad relationships with the Congolese. So when they take over, what you see is that there is a mild negative effect on household well-being, even though it's not statistically significant. And but when it's the other side of the conflict that creates those functions, the Congolese militia, then you see unambiguously always the household assets improving. The same is true when the Congolese state takes control of villages. They have the same effect as Congolese militia. So that's kind of a nuance which I find interesting, because we tend to think in economic states are good, bandits are bad, but in fact the two come from the same continuum, and neither is good or bad. It's going to depend on what they are maximizing. So on the one hand, they provide protection, on the other, they are stealing through taxation. So whether they're good or bad is going to depend on the relative effect of the value of protection and how much they take, but also how bad it would be without them, which is the value of protection. And so that was kind of a nuance. It can be good, it can be bad. It really depends on their origins or what they're maximizing.
Now we've talked a lot about the results, but the question is, how did you arrive at those results? What's the data? Because I guess you didn't go to some statistical office in Kinshasa, but you had to collect stuff on the ground, right?
Yes. So for a long time, the data that I use, which is not in the paper, is qualitative. And so I spent many months talking to people who reconstructed the histories and explained the logic for why things happened. And then based on that informal data, then to test some of the hypotheses or questions that emerged, one needed data back in the past. And not only there was no data today, there's also no data back in the past. Why was it needed in the past? Because the price shocks occurred in the past. And so then I spent many months trying to figure out whether it's even possible to reconstruct the data from the past. And so I built a team of people who I had worked with for a number of years before as part of other projects. And we went to villages trying to find strategies to reconstruct the history of a village. And so this team of people who are 10 individuals were basically, they're all university graduates from the area. They ended up being so embedded in the project that they're basically historians now. And so what we designed is a system where a team of 2 of them would spend 1 week in every village. And of course, it's all series of problems. People may remember poorly, people may want to lie. And so during the whole week, there's a set of strategies to get around the problem of people forgetting dates, for instance. There's a system called time queues. It's very easy for people to remember. I don't remember when I first, when something happened in my life, but if you ask me, was it before or after I went to university, I immediately remember. Or if it was before or after there was a given government or before or after big historical events in the planet, such as, I don't know, 9/11 or the war against ISIS. It's very easy to remember, oh, it was before that. And so in the Congo, because it's an active conflict, it became obvious that people remember very easily if they got married before Mobutu or after, even when they didn't know the exact year. And so for certain actions, such as important actions in the life of a person, such as was there a monopoly of violence by an armed actor in your village, very often there were 2 or 3 episodes in their life. So we could spend a lot of time discussing for each of those episodes and trying to identify the years, who they were, and so on. But in addition, the historians spent 1 week in every village. They speak to 8 households. For each household, it's a day-long conversation with lunch, with breaks, with snacks. They are building ties. And these 8 conversations in private allow to kind of double check the sources from different households. So finally, by the end of the week, they know the history of the village by heart. And then there's a day-long meeting with the village authorities who they have trained every day of the week to reconstruct, to fill a series of forms with the history of the village. And then that information gets contrasted. And so when we were doing some pilots, we realized that the armed groups information was nothing sensitive at all. In the places where it was controlled by the armed groups, they were embedded in society. We had the authorization. Everyone was happy to say, yes, they are here. Look, they're providing protection. Or like, yeah, this person doesn't like them, but that's life. That's the state here. And most places they were no longer there. And so it was not taboo. Perhaps it could have been more taboo whether someone collaborated with one or another, but whether they controlled the village, that was very easy. We found that the taboo questions was whether there is a tax in the local mill, that the chief is taxing, the population is upset. We learned about it from the household interviews. The chief didn't tell us, then we confronted the chief and he accepted. So that's kind of what led to the belief that we can collect the information, at least the basic variables, to test the basic questions. And so that would be 200 villages, more or less, yeah.
It sounds like it took you a lot of time to collect those data. And I know it's not easy. It's been a challenge, I imagine. What do you find very challenging about this line of research, and what do you find very exciting about this line of research?
I think what was challenging, I can tell you now because I'm at the end of the burnout phase of doing this type of work. And what's extremely challenging is that you invest yourself physically and emotionally into managing dozens and hundreds of people who view the world very differently than you. It's a different country, but the extent to which they view it differently goes much deeper than you may initially think. And so nurturing labor relations that are and have to be personalized in nature, because that's the way labor relations work. In fact, in my country of birth and in the Congo, much less so in the United States. But it's very consuming emotionally as well, because you can't separate work relationships from friendship, even if there is big asymmetries of power. So that was very draining, as much as it was incredibly exciting. But then checking for the money being spent, applying for funding, I guess at a bigger scale, perhaps, is the security situation played a role at exhausting me personally. I think it's a very challenging aspect because you go to areas that have active armed groups. This specific study was relatively easy in that regard, but still it's a challenging aspect on other types of research. After the study, I became perhaps a bit more ambitious. I ended up working with the armed groups themselves for 7 years now, and working inside their administrative records or infiltrating state agencies to look at corruption hierarchies. And I think once you start, that's what's challenging. You can't stop, and it becomes ever growing in its challenges. I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's the security situation. To look at those questions is almost by construction a big challenge for the people you work with and for you. So I have in my office a letter by the Secret Service of the Congolese state that declares that I am a spy for the American government and that they have to shut down all my operations. That was in 2016 or 17. So now I have it as a drawing, an image in there. But in reality, it was very stressful. All of this is resolved informally. People in the Secret Service knew that I wasn't a spy, but someone hated the person I worked with, and it was a conflict between two people of competing ethnic groups. For one ethnic group, it was not important. For the other, it was. So they tried to undermine each other by accusing each other of being spies, and then so these kind of problems are just always there. That's challenging. Exciting for me. I think when you work in those contexts, it's what's immensely exciting is, number one, it completely leads your preconceived ideas that you took as granted to unravel about what is even a state, how is society organized, what's the meaning of friendship even, and to me, I grew incredibly as a person, but that's really personal. And second, I think at the human level, it turns out that people in the Congo are extremely warm and friendly. That's not an African preconceived idea. It's very different across the board. In Rwanda, if you want, that the country looks much more like Switzerland in the culture. But Congo is an extremely colorful country with people who are immediately take you as their family and who are incredibly genuine and warm. Of course, it's difficult to manage the asymmetry of power, being a white person with money, with all sorts of racial biases, to deconstruct that are unconscious. But I found this to be incredibly rewarding. So I built very strong friendships, which also were a big part of growing myself. So.
Amazing. Now, you talked about recall. So let's go back in your own life. When you were in high school, is that the career you had in mind, or how did you end up an economist?
So I think I wanted to do philosophy, but I think in retrospect, I'm not that far off. Or anthropology. But the reason that I felt pushed towards economics was twofold. The first was a mistake because I thought that it was more like sociology, and then I saw the power of the tools and I continued. But the second is my own personal background. I come from Spain. Spain had a civil war not so long ago, to the point that it really marked the families of my parents. And my parents then lived through a dictatorship for 30 or 40 years in a country that was extremely poor. And so this background, growing up in France with a welfare state taken as given, with amazing education just available for everyone. France has its problems, but on an economic level and on a political level, it created the question, how is that happening? How is it possible that certain countries undergo these social processes related to violence, weak state, and conflict? And I guess this kind of sensitivity towards poverty coming from the background of my father made it so that economics was also, in fact, intentional, because I felt philosophy and all of that was nice entertainment for me, but I thought, given that I had the privilege to have this public education in France, I wanted to do something perhaps more useful, given the preoccupations I had at the time. Today, I don't have the same motivation. I'm not interested in saving the planet anymore. I find the planet too complicated to even understand. So I just became cynical and stepped back, even though I keep the same childhood dreams. So.
Wow, fascinating. Raul, thank you so much. That was a great journey through your research experience and also through your life. And thanks for being with us today. And I hope we can talk to you again in the future about some ongoing and future research you do. Thank you again. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Raul, and thank you, Sascha, for running the interview. See you at the next one.